He didn't realize jealousy could feel this sharp, until he saw her smile for someone else. The soft hum of conversation drifted through the grand ballroom, crystal glasses clinking under warm golden lights, the kind of place where every detail whispered power and precision, where deals were made with handshakes and quiet nods, and nothing, absolutely nothing, was left to chance. Yet somehow, in the middle of all that control, Ryan Mitchell felt something slip through his fingers. He stood near the edge of the room, a glass of aged bourbon resting untouched in his hand, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression unreadable to anyone watching. But inside, something had shifted, something he couldn't name yet, not until the moment his eyes landed on a phone screen held carelessly by one of the junior executives nearby. A laugh, a careless swipe, and then, her. Lily Carter. There she was, frozen in a frame, her head tilted slightly, her smile soft in a way he had never seen inside the office walls, her eyes brighter, warmer, like she belonged somewhere else entirely, and beside her, a man, close enough that their shoulders touched, his arm just behind her back, not quite holding her, but close enough to suggest something more, something personal, something that didn't belong to Ryan, and the caption below it. Simple, casual, but devastating in its ambiguity. For a second, the room around him blurred, the conversations fading into a distant echo as his grip tightened around the glass, his mind replaying every interaction he'd had with her. Every quiet moment she had stepped into his office with that steady calm, every time she had stayed late without being asked, every time she had looked at him like he wasn't just a title or a name on a building, but a person. Someone carrying more than he let the world see. He had told himself it meant nothing. That she was just efficient. Just professional. Just another employee. But now, watching that image burn into his memory, something inside him rejected that lie completely. Because if she was just an employee, then why did it feel like something had been taken from him? Why did the thought of her laughing like that with someone else feel like a quiet betrayal he had never agreed to? Ryan exhaled slowly, setting the glass down on a passing tray without taking a sip, his jaw tightening just enough to hint at the storm beneath the surface, his mind already shifting from confusion to something colder, more controlled, more dangerous. Not anger, not yet, but something sharper, something quieter, something that looked like indifference from the outside but felt nothing like it underneath. Across the room, a burst of laughter rose again, light and effortless, and for the first time that night, Ryan Mitchell found himself unable to focus on the million-dollar conversations happening around him, because all he could see was that image, that smile, and the question he couldn't shake no matter how hard he tried. Who was she, when she wasn't standing in front of him? Ryan did not sleep that night, not because he had too much work, but because for the first time in years, his thoughts refused to follow his commands, circling back again and again to that image, to the way Lily had looked at ease, unguarded, like she had stepped into a life he was not part of, and by the time the city lights faded into the pale gray of early morning, he had already convinced himself of something he could not quite justify but could not ignore either, that whatever existed between them, however undefined, had been crossed without him even realizing it. By the time he stepped into the office, everything about him was composed again, his expression calm, his movements precise, the version of Ryan Mitchell the world expected, but there was a difference, subtle yet unmistakable, something colder beneath the surface, something sharper in the way his eyes scanned the room as if searching for confirmation of a story he had already begun to believe. Lily was already there, as she always was, seated at her desk with a stack of reports neatly aligned, her posture straight, her focus steady, the quiet efficiency that had made her indispensable to him over the past year, and for a brief second, he paused, watching her from a distance, noticing details he had overlooked before, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she concentrated, the way her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, the way she seemed completely unaware of the storm building just a few feet away from her. She looked exactly the same, and yet, to him, everything felt different. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," she said when she noticed him, her voice calm, her expression neutral but warm enough to carry a hint of familiarity that no one else in the office received, and for a moment, that simple greeting almost broke through his tension, almost reminded him of the countless mornings she had grounded him with nothing more than her steady presence. But then the image flashed again, that smile, that man. And the warmth in her voice suddenly felt misplaced, almost deceptive. "Morning," he replied, his tone even, but there was a distance in it now, a deliberate restraint that did not go unnoticed, at least not by her, because her eyes lingered for half a second longer than usual, searching his face as if trying to read something that had changed overnight. He walked past her without another word, setting his briefcase down in his office, the glass walls offering just enough transparency for him to see her reflection if he chose to look, and he did, more often than he should have, each glance pulling him deeper into a quiet frustration he refused to name. Minutes later, he called her in, his voice clipped through the intercom, and when she stepped inside, holding her tablet, ready as always, he did not look at her right away, choosing instead to scan the documents in front of him as if they required more attention than they did. "I need you to handle the client briefing this afternoon," he said finally, his tone professional, detached, the kind he used with every other employee, not the one he had reserved for her before. Lily hesitated, just slightly, because that assignment usually came with preparation they had not discussed, but she nodded anyway, adjusting quickly, as she always did. "Of course," she said, her voice steady, but there was a question beneath it, unspoken, waiting. He finally looked up, meeting her eyes, and for a brief second, something almost surfaced, something that could have been honesty, or confusion, or even vulnerability, but he pushed it down just as quickly, replacing it with something safer, something colder. "And clear your schedule for the rest of the week," he added, his gaze unwavering now. "You will be reporting directly to me on every project." It was not a promotion. It was not a reward. It was control. Lily blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift, but she nodded again, because that was what she did. She adapted, she delivered, she trusted that there was a reason behind every decision he made, even when it was not explained. But as she turned to leave, something in the air felt heavier than before, like a line had been drawn without words, and neither of them fully understood what crossing it would cost. By noon, the rhythm between them had completely changed, and it was not something anyone else in the office could clearly define, but they could feel it in the way conversations slowed when Lily walked past Ryan's glass office, in the way his door stayed closed longer than usual, in the way she no longer stepped in with quiet confidence but paused for just a fraction of a second before knocking, as if recalibrating a connection that had once felt effortless. Inside, Ryan sat behind his desk, reviewing numbers that normally required his full attention, but today, every few minutes, his mind drifted, pulling him back to fragments he could not shut off, the image of her from the night before blending uncomfortably with memories that now felt too personal to ignore, like the late evenings when she had stayed back long after everyone else had gone home, not because she was asked, but because she noticed he had not left yet, setting a cup of coffee near his desk without interrupting him, or the time he had lost his temper during a difficult call, and she had simply stood there afterward, calm and steady, saying, "You handled that better than you think," as if she saw something in him that no one else ever did. Back then, he had dismissed those moments as coincidence, as professionalism, as nothing more than her doing her job, but now, sitting in the silence of his office, he could not help but question every assumption he had made, and that uncertainty made him sharper, more controlled, more determined to keep everything within boundaries he understood. When Lily stepped in again later that afternoon with the briefing materials, she carried herself the same way she always did, composed, prepared, her voice even as she walked him through the details, but there was a distance now, not cold, not defensive, just careful, like she had sensed the shift and chosen not to challenge it, and somehow, that made it worse. Ryan listened, or at least appeared to, his eyes on the documents, his expression unreadable. But every time she leaned slightly closer to point something out, every time her voice softened on a detail she knew mattered to him, he felt that same tension tighten again, not because of what she was doing, but because of what he had seen, what he believed, and what he could not reconcile. Halfway through her explanation, her phone vibrated softly on the table between them, just once, a small interruption that should have meant nothing, but his eyes flicked to it immediately, faster than he intended, catching the name that appeared briefly on the screen before it dimmed again, and even though he only saw it for a second, it was enough to confirm the presence of someone else in her world. Someone who existed outside the carefully structured space he controlled. Lily reached for the phone instinctively, silencing it without checking the message, her focus returning to him without hesitation, but the damage was already done, at least in his mind, because now it was no longer just an image, it was real, it was present, it was part of her life in a way he had never considered before. "You can take that if it is important," he said suddenly, his voice calm but edged with something sharper beneath the surface, something that did not match the words, and she looked up at him, slightly surprised, shaking her head. "It can wait," she replied, her tone sincere, but to Ryan, it sounded like a choice, a decision he had no right to question yet could not stop himself from analyzing. He leaned back in his chair, studying her now, really studying her, as if trying to find something in her expression that would either confirm or disprove the narrative forming in his mind, but all he saw was the same steady composure, the same quiet loyalty she had always shown, and that contradiction unsettled him more than anything else, because if she was the same person she had always been, then why did everything feel so different now? For the first time, the question shifted, no longer about who she was, but about what he had allowed himself to believe, and whether he had already crossed a line he could not step back from, even if he wanted to. By late afternoon, the air inside the office had grown heavier, not with noise or chaos, but with something quieter, something unspoken that seemed to stretch between them every time they were in the same room, and Ryan found himself watching Lily more than he should have, noticing patterns he had never cared to observe before, the exact time she took her coffee break, the way she checked her phone only when she thought no one was looking, the subtle change in her expression when a message came through, not a smile exactly, but a softness that did not belong to the version of her he knew inside these walls. It should not have mattered, and yet it did, more than he was willing to admit, more than he could justify, and the contradiction made him sharper, more controlled, more deliberate in every interaction. When the executive team gathered for the late-day strategy meeting, the room filled with quiet authority, leather chairs pulled in, tablets lighting up, voices measured and precise, but beneath that polished surface, Ryan carried something else entirely, something unresolved that had been building since the night before, and without realizing it, he let it slip into the space where it did not belong. Lily stood near the screen, presenting the briefing he had assigned her that morning, her voice steady, her delivery clear, moving through data and projections with the same confidence that had always made her reliable, and for a moment, everything felt normal again, predictable, controlled, until it was not. "Let us talk about professional boundaries," Ryan said suddenly, cutting in without warning. His tone calm but carrying a weight that shifted the entire room's attention toward him, the words seemingly general, almost routine, yet directed in a way that made it impossible to ignore who they were meant for. A subtle silence followed, not long, but enough for people to notice, enough for Lily's voice to pause for just a fraction of a second before she regained her composure, her eyes meeting his briefly, searching for clarity that did not come. "In this company," he continued, leaning slightly forward, his gaze steady, "we expect focus, discretion, and a clear separation between personal matters and professional responsibilities." No one spoke, no one interrupted, because no one needed to. The implication was already there, hovering just beneath the surface, and Lily understood it, not fully, not the cause behind it, but the message itself, and that was enough. She nodded once, acknowledging the statement without reacting, her posture still straight, her voice returning to the presentation as if nothing had happened, but the shift was there, subtle yet undeniable, like a line had been crossed in front of everyone without being openly declared. Ryan watched her closely, expecting something, a reaction, a hesitation, anything that would confirm the narrative in his mind, but she gave him none of it, only professionalism, only control, only the same quiet strength she had always carried, and somehow that made it worse, because it left him alone with his assumptions, his questions, and the growing realization that whatever he thought he understood, he might not understand at all. When the meeting ended, the The room slowly emptied, chairs sliding back, conversations resuming in low voices. But Lily did not linger. She gathered her materials with steady hands and walked out without looking back, and for the first time since this began, Ryan felt something shift in a way he could not control, not anger, not frustration, but something closer to regret, faint and unfamiliar, yet impossible to ignore. Because the distance between them was no longer just in his mind, it had become real, and he had been the one to create it. The silence that followed her exit did not settle the way Ryan expected it to. It did not bring clarity or relief. It only left behind a quiet weight that stayed with him long after the conference room emptied, long after the last echo of footsteps faded down the hallway. And as he stood there for a moment longer than necessary, staring at the door she had walked through without looking back, he realized something that unsettled him more than anything else so far. He had expected her to react, to defend herself, to question him, but she had not done any of that. She had simply accepted the moment and moved forward, and somehow that made him feel like the one who had lost control. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and decisions that normally required his full attention, yet everything felt slightly off, like a system running perfectly on the surface while something deeper remained unresolved. And by the time the office began to quiet down for the evening, with lights dimming and desks emptying one by one, Ryan found himself unable to focus on anything except the absence of the one person who had quietly become part of his daily rhythm. He noticed it in small ways first, the absence of a neatly organized stack of documents on his desk before he even asked for them, the missing cup of coffee that usually appeared without a word, the silence outside his office door where her presence had once been steady and predictable, and it was in those small absences that the full weight of what had changed began to settle in. He stepped out of his office, glancing toward her desk almost instinctively, only to find it empty, her chair pushed in neatly, her workspace cleared in a way that felt too final for something temporary, and a faint tension tightened in his chest as he realized she had left earlier than usual, something she had never done before. For a moment, he considered letting it go, telling himself it did not matter, that she was entitled to her time, that nothing had actually changed in any official sense. But the thought did not hold. It slipped away almost immediately, replaced by a growing need to understand, to regain some sense of control over a situation that no longer felt as clear as it once had. Without overthinking it, he reached for his phone, scrolling briefly before stopping on her contact, his thumb hovering for a second before he pressed call, the ringing sound stretching longer than he expected, each second amplifying the tension he had tried to ignore all day. Until finally, her voice came through, calm but distant in a way that mirrored the shift between them. "Hello, Mr. Mitchell," she said, the formality in her tone more pronounced than before, and that alone was enough to confirm what he had been avoiding, that whatever line had been crossed earlier had not gone unnoticed. He exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully, or at least trying to, because for once, they did not come as easily as they should have. "You left early," he said, the statement simple, almost neutral, but carrying a weight he could not quite hide. There was a brief pause on the other end, not long, but enough to suggest she was considering how to respond, and when she spoke again, her voice remained steady, controlled, but no longer warm in the way he had grown used to. "I completed everything that was required for today," she replied, her tone professional, precise, as if she were speaking in the middle of a meeting rather than answering a call after hours. Ryan tightened his grip slightly on the phone, the response technically correct, yet somehow missing everything he had actually meant to ask, and for the first time, he realized that whatever had existed between them before, whatever unspoken understanding had filled the gaps between formal words, was no longer there, replaced by something more distant, more guarded, something he had created without fully understanding the cost. "And the rest of the week?" he asked, his voice lower now, less certain than before, and again there was that brief pause, that careful consideration on her side before she answered. "I will follow your instructions," she said simply, and this time, there was no ambiguity, no softness, just professionalism, clean and complete, and it hit him in a way he had not expected, not because of what she said, but because of what she no longer chose to say, because for the first time since he had met her, She was no longer offering anything beyond what was required, no more, no less, and as the call ended shortly after, with nothing resolved and nothing added, Ryan stood alone in the quiet of his office, staring at the dark screen in his hand, realizing that whatever control he thought he had maintained, he might have already lost something far more important without even realizing it. The next morning arrived with a quiet stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the world itself had decided to pause just long enough for everything unspoken between them to settle into something more permanent. And when Ryan stepped into the office, he knew before even looking that something had shifted again, not dramatically, not in a way others would notice, but in the kind of subtle way that only mattered when it mattered too much. Lily was already at her desk, just like always, her posture composed, her workspace perfectly organized, her focus locked onto the screen in front of her. But the familiarity stopped there, because when she looked up and acknowledged him, there was no trace of the quiet warmth that used to soften her tone, only a polite, measured professionalism that matched everyone else in the building, and that difference, small as it was, landed harder than anything she could have said. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice steady, her expression neutral, and for a brief moment, Ryan felt the urge to correct something he could not quite define, to reach for a version of the morning that no longer existed, but the words never came, replaced instead by the same controlled response he had been relying on since the night everything changed. "Good morning," he replied, his tone equally formal, the exchange clean, efficient, and completely devoid of the familiarity that had once made it effortless. The day moved forward with a precision that felt almost mechanical, tasks assigned, reports delivered, meetings scheduled, everything functioning exactly as it should on the surface, yet beneath it all, there was a growing tension neither of them acknowledged, a quiet awareness that something essential had been removed and replaced with something far less human. Ryan found himself watching her again, not openly, not in a way that would draw attention, but in brief, controlled glances that revealed more than he intended, noticing how she no longer lingered near his office, how she no longer anticipated his needs before he voiced them, how every interaction now followed a clear boundary she had drawn without ever stating it. It was efficient, it was professional, and it was completely unfamiliar. Late in the afternoon, as the office settled into its usual rhythm, Lily gathered her things with the same calm precision she applied to everything else, checking her phone briefly before slipping it into her bag, and for a second, Ryan saw it again, that same softness in her expression, that same quiet shift that did not belong to the version of her he knew here, and before he could stop himself, something inside him moved faster than reason. "Who is he?" The question came out sharper than intended, cutting through the space between them before either of them had time to soften it, and the moment it landed, the entire atmosphere changed. Lily froze, her hands still resting on the edge of her desk, her eyes lifting slowly to meet his, confusion flickering across her face before it settled into something more guarded, more deliberate. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice calm but edged with something new, something that had not been there before. Ryan stepped closer, not aggressively, not forcefully, but with a presence that carried weight, his gaze fixed on her as if the answer mattered more than anything else in that moment. "The man in the photo," he said, his tone lower now but no less intense, the words leaving no room for misunderstanding, and for a brief second, something flashed in Lily's eyes, not guilt, not fear, but surprise, followed quickly by something else, something steadier, something that did not retreat. "That is not something you get to ask," she replied, her voice controlled, each word measured, not defensive, not emotional, just clear, and the simplicity of her response hit harder than any denial could have. Ryan held her gaze, waiting, expecting something more, an explanation, a justification, anything that would align with the assumptions he had already built, but she offered nothing beyond what she had said, no elaboration, no attempt to ease the tension, just a boundary drawn with quiet certainty. For a moment neither of them moved, the silence stretching just long enough to make everything feel heavier than it was, until Lily reached for her bag again, her movements steady, deliberate, as if the conversation had already ended for her. "If there is nothing else," she added, her tone returning to that same professional distance, I will see you tomorrow. And just like that, she walked past him, not hurried, not hesitant, leaving behind a space that felt emptier than before. And for the first time since this began, Ryan realized that whatever control he thought he had been maintaining was slipping away completely. Because this was no longer about a photo, or a misunderstanding, it was about a line he had crossed, and a distance he might not know how to close. The door closed behind her with a quiet finality that echoed longer than it should have, and for a moment, Ryan stood exactly where she had left him, his mind replaying her words, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a steady persistence that made them impossible to ignore. Because she had not raised her voice, she had not argued, she had not even tried to defend herself, she had simply drawn a line, and in doing so, she had shifted something fundamental between them that could not be undone. With authority or control. The office felt different after that, not empty, not silent, but distant, like a space that no longer responded to him the way it used to, and as the evening stretched on, Ryan found himself unable to return to the version of himself that had existed before that conversation, because for the first time, the question was no longer about her, it was about him, about why he had asked something he had no right to ask, about why the answer mattered more than it should have. He moved through the rest of the evening mechanically, reviewing documents, answering emails, signing off on decisions that normally required his full attention, yet none of it stayed with him. None of it anchored him the way it usually did, because beneath it all, there was a growing realization he could no longer ignore, that what he had dismissed as irritation or control was something far more personal, something he had not planned for and certainly had not prepared to face. When he finally left the building, the city had already shifted into its nighttime rhythm, lights reflecting off glass towers, traffic moving in steady streams, everything continuing exactly as it always did. And yet, for him, something had changed in a way that made all of it feel slightly out of place. He did not go home right away, instead finding himself driving without a clear destination, the quiet hum of the car filling the space where his thoughts refused to settle, until almost without thinking, he slowed near a familiar street, one he had only been to once before, months ago, when he had dropped Lily off after a late meeting because it had been raining and she had insisted she could manage on her own. And yet he had not left until he saw her safely inside. The memory came back with unexpected clarity, not just the location, but the way she had smiled that night, tired but genuine, thanking him in a way that felt personal, not obligatory. And for the first time since this began, Ryan realized how easily he had overlooked those moments, how quickly he had reduced them to routine, to something ordinary, when in reality, they had never been that simple. He parked a short distance away, not out of hesitation, but because he was not entirely sure what he was doing, only that he could not ignore the pull that had brought him there. And as he sat there, watching the quiet building where she lived, he felt something shift again, not sharp, not overwhelming, but clear in a way that left no room for denial. This was not about a photo. It was not about a man he did not know. It was about the fact that somewhere along the way, without permission, without acknowledgement, she had become important to him in a way that changed how he saw everything else, and instead of understanding that, he had reacted with control, with distance, with something that pushed her away rather than bringing her closer. He exhaled slowly, leaning back in his seat, the realization settling in with a quiet weight that felt both unfamiliar and unavoidable, because now that he saw it clearly, there was no way to go back to not knowing, no way to pretend it was anything less than what it was. And for the first time since he had seen that image, the question was no longer who she was with, but whether he had already damaged something that might not be easy to repair. The next day did not offer the clarity Ryan had hoped for, only a sharper awareness of everything he had misunderstood, and as he stepped into the office, the usual rhythm felt almost unfamiliar, as if the space itself had adjusted to a version of him that no longer fit as easily as before. Lily was already there again, composed as ever, but now there was something resolute in the way she carried herself, a quiet independence that had replaced the subtle attentiveness she once showed him. And for the first time, Ryan understood that this was not distance created by circumstance, it was distance chosen. He did not approach her immediately, not because he did not want to, but because he knew that whatever he said next would matter in a way his words rarely did, and for once, he could not rely on control or authority to shape the outcome. The morning passed with minimal interaction, emails replacing conversations, formal instructions replacing the quiet understanding they once shared, until just before noon, when something unexpected shifted the course of everything. It began with a conversation he was not meant to overhear, voices just beyond the open corridor near the break area, Lily's voice among them, calm but softer than it had been in his presence, speaking in a way that felt personal, not guarded. "You do not have to worry about it anymore," she said, her tone gentle, reassuring, followed by a pause that suggested she was listening, and then, "I told you I would handle it, and I did." Ryan stopped without meaning to, not close enough to intrude, but close enough to catch the pieces that followed, pieces that did not align with the assumptions he had built. "No, it was not a date," she added. Quietly, a faint hint of a smile in her voice that carried something lighter, something familiar. "He is my brother, and he needed someone there that day." The words settled slowly, almost too quietly, but their impact was immediate, cutting through every version of the story Ryan had constructed, unraveling it in a way that left nothing behind to defend. He remained still for a second longer than necessary, his mind recalibrating, shifting from certainty to realization in a way that felt both abrupt and inevitable, because now that he heard it, it was obvious, painfully obvious, and everything that followed his initial reaction felt heavier, more deliberate, more wrong. Lily continued speaking, unaware of his presence, her tone shifting slightly as she added, "It was important to him, and that is enough for me." And there was something in that statement, something simple and grounded, that made Ryan understand the difference between what she valued and what he had assumed, the difference between quiet loyalty and the narrative he had forced onto her without asking. He stepped back before she could see him, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, unfamiliar respect for the boundaries she had drawn, and for the first time since this began, he did not feel the need to confront her immediately, to demand clarity, to control the situation. Instead, he returned to his office with a clarity he had not expected, not comforting, not easy, but honest in a way that left no room for denial. The image that had consumed him the night before now felt different, not because it had changed, but because he finally saw what had been there all along, not deception, not distance, but a life that existed beyond him, one he had no right to define or question. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, the realization settling in with a quiet weight that felt deserved, because now the problem was no longer confusion, it was accountability, it was understanding that the distance between them had not been created by what he saw, but by how he chose to react to it. And for the first time, the question was no longer about what she owed him, but about what he owed her, and whether he was willing to step out from behind the version of himself that controlled everything, to face the part of him that had gotten it wrong. Ryan did not wait until the end of the day this time, he did not let the distance stretch any further than it already had, because now that he understood what he had gotten wrong, the weight of it refused to sit quietly, and for the first time in a long time, he chose not to calculate the moment, not to prepare a perfect approach, but to act before he could talk himself out of it. He stepped out of his office with a steadiness that felt different, not controlled, not guarded, but deliberate in a way that carried honesty rather than authority. And when he reached her desk, Lily looked up, her expression neutral as always, her posture composed, but there was still that boundary in her eyes, that quiet distance that had replaced something much warmer, something he now realized he had taken for granted. "Do you have a minute?" he asked, his voice calm, but without the edge it had carried before, and she hesitated for just a fraction of a second before nodding, setting her work aside and following him into his office, the same space where everything had shifted days earlier, but this time, the atmosphere felt different, less tense, more uncertain, like something was about to change but neither of them knew exactly how. He did not sit behind his desk, he did not create that barrier between them, instead he remained standing, giving the moment a level ground it had not had before, and for a second, he simply looked at her, not searching for answers, not analyzing, just seeing her clearly without the filter he had imposed on her before. "I was wrong," he said, the words simple, direct, and for once, completely unguarded, and the effect was immediate, her expression shifting slightly, not softened, not yet, but no longer as distant as it had been. He exhaled quietly, continuing before hesitation could take over. About the photo, about the assumption I made, about the way I spoke to you, he added, his voice steady, each word placed with intention rather than control. I let something personal interfere with something I should have handled better. Lily watched him carefully, her eyes steady, as if measuring not just what he was saying, but how he was saying it, and for a moment, the silence between them felt heavier than any words could have been, until she finally spoke. You did, she said simply, not harsh, not emotional, just honest, and somehow that made it easier for him to continue, because she was not dismissing it, she was acknowledging it. Ryan nodded once, accepting it without defense. I do not expect you to overlook that, he said, his tone quieter now. But I needed you to know that I understand what I did, and that it was not fair to you. Another pause followed, but this one felt different, not tense, not guarded, just open, like a space where something new could exist if they chose to let it. Lily's posture shifted slightly, not fully relaxed, but no longer rigid, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something that had been missing since the distance began. You crossed a line, she said, her gaze steady. And you made it personal in a way it should not have been. Ryan met her eyes without looking away this time. I know, he replied, and for once, he did not try to explain it away, did not try to justify it, he simply accepted it, and that difference did not go unnoticed. The silence that followed was quieter, softer, and when Lily finally exhaled, there was a subtle shift in her expression, not a full return to what had been before, but a small step away from the distance she had created to protect herself. It will take time, she said, her tone measured but